Hi, everyone. There are two other concepts that I'd like to talk about. All four of these concepts, including the last two, spirit and soul, relate to what I call a spiritual path. And the overarching question in these videos that I'm addressing is, what is a spiritual path? I don't plan to answer that question, but I think it's like a koan, which is in Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism in particular, like a riddle which one meditates on. And it's not that important to find an answer, or at least a fixed final answer, but to let the self meditate on the possible answers to the riddle of the koan. So what is a spiritual path is an example of, for me, a koan. So the other two aspects I want to talk about now in this video are shadow and ego. I get the concept of shadow from Carl Jung, who talked about two aspects of shadow. The first aspect is the part of ourselves that we reject or feel ashamed of. And this could be part of an individual or part of society, part of a group. So that's the shadow, and we can use it as a verb to enshadow a part of ourselves. So my example for this is that for a long time I used to enshadow what have been called the feminine aspects of the self. So for example, being in touch with one's emotions, especially crying, tears, uncertainty, being vulnerable, admitting to being hurt. All of these aspects I used to push away, and when I felt them, I would feel ashamed. I would feel I'm a boy or a man and I shouldn't feel those things. So whenever we get into that state of I shouldn't be feeling this, it can often be the shadow that we're pushing away. We're disowning that part of ourselves. Another example is when we feel like we're not good enough, or something we do is not good enough. We are enshadowing, or we are enshadowed in that period. So the other aspect of shadow for Carl Jung was the life that we might have lived had we made other choices. So you can see how one might regret having made certain choices and wish that one's life were different. And in that sense, we're enshadowing our current life because we're rejecting it. We're saying, or we're considering the possibility that some other life would have been better for us. So my example of this is my family came to India when I was 6 years old, and I've sometimes wondered what my life would be like if I were in India, and sometimes I might have seen my possible life in India with rose-colored glasses, because I think part of the self is sadomasochistic, and we create scenarios, imaginary scenarios, in which we cause damage to ourselves, and we seem to derive some kind of pleasure for this. So going along the path of, oh, what if my life had been like this? Would I have been happier in these respects, for example? So India was the country of my birth, and so I wonder whether I would have felt less alienated living there than I have sometimes felt in Canada, especially growing up here. But maybe I would have felt alienated in other ways. And I feel like when our mind goes to this kind of sadomasochistic remembrance of paths that we could have taken, one option is to say, well, what do I desire? What am I looking for? And see how we can manifest that in our current existence with the choices that we have made. So that's my little discussion of shadow. I also want to talk about ego. So the way I understand the concept of ego is shaped in part by Sigmund Freud's notion of ego. So Freud had different conceptions of the self at different times in his life. And by self, I just mean the person. At one point, he said that there were three aspects to the self, and I'm simplifying Freud here. He talked about the id. So the id is the aspect of us that is wild, passionate, often aggressive, and the source of our violent and sexual desires. In contrast to this, Freud talked about the concept of the superego, which is the morality that we inherit. So the aspect of us that says, no, you shouldn't do that. So we inherit this morality from our parents, from peers, from teachers, and other authority figures. The ego, then, is this bridging aspect of the self that continually reconciles the id and the superego. When we consider a path of action, something that might be aggressive, for example, the superego might intervene and say, no, that's, how would that person feel? That wouldn't be the right thing to do. So the ego, or what I would say indirectly is the personality, is formed in some ways by the ways that we make our choices reconciling id and superego. I also think of the id as a kind of carapace or protective shell. So when we are crossing the street, we're taught from a young age to look left, right, left, if we're in Canada and people are driving on the right side. I'm based in Canada, so we look left first. And so after that, it becomes what we call second nature or instinctive. Indeed, our instinct is to preserve ourselves, and that's an egoic desire. So this protective shell that we have around ourselves, or the desire to protect ourselves, in my view, the ego is also involved in times when we need validation, and when we need love and affirmation and recognition and attention. In my spiritual path, I don't feel it's important to transcend the ego, but I would like to talk about another concept, the self, which includes the ego, and it's a position that we can assume rather than fully occupying the egoic position all the time. In other words, letting the ego run the show all the time. We can move to a position of greater selfhood. So I'll talk about that hopefully later. My example of ego is online dating, which I've done on and off over the years. And one of the interesting things, I have some background learning about Buddhism, and that's a part of my spiritual practice, Buddhist techniques and learnings. So what can sometimes happen after you've gone on a couple of dates, I'll just speak for myself, is you start to have certain expectations. So when that person doesn't respond to your text in a certain amount of time, you wonder, are they still interested in you? And we have this phenomenon called ghosting, where somebody just leaves the conversation. So I was finding with a particular woman that my expectations were rising as we got to know each other more and more. And I feel that this is natural. It's not abhorrent behavior, but it can start to make you unhappy because your desires are not being met, your expectations are not being met. And indeed, you are imposing those expectations on another person. So in that moment, after I was unhappy with not getting the responses to these texts as quickly as I would like, which is in my case about a day, under normal circumstances. I started to feel unhappy, feel that my needs were not being met, and when I was sitting with that unhappiness long enough, I realized that I had, in a sense, created the conditions for it to exist. And so that was a perception from myself, from the perspective of myself. I was able to take a larger view of my egoic needs and able to get those needs for love met with other people, like friends and family. I want to talk about one more concept, which is the self. And for me, the self is the system that you could say contains all of these four concepts. So spirit, soul, shadow, and ego. And the self contains multiple systems within it. This is the way I use the word self. So you could think of the ego as a system, the soul, the spirit, and the shadow. Their configurations, or you could say complexes, perhaps. But of course, there are also the more physiological systems. So we have respiration, circulation, and we often think of the self as coterminous with the body. But in fact, the body is being acted upon all the time by its environment, both what's outside it and what's inside it. So we have the expression, you are what you eat, in terms of food. But also we're always affected by gravity, right? Our bodies are being affected by gravity, and we live in this state that we call time. People age. So it's not that the self is a completely self-contained unit. It's continually being impacted by the environment. But we have this idea that the self is autonomous, self-regulating, and so on. We can certainly find ways to be more self-reliant, but I think it's a mistake to think of the self as entirely separate from the environment. We exist in a permeable relationship with our environment. Another example is that we need oxygen, for example. So my example for self is that I'm a member of the Unitarian congregation of Vancouver, and when I enter into a service, this was in the time that we were still having in-person services before the pandemic. During that service, multiple aspects of myself would be served. So we can divide up the self in various ways. We can say the self is physiological with the body. And so I walk into the space that we call the sanctuary. And then there are times when we greet our neighbors. So before COVID, sometimes we would shake hands. We would get up to sing hymns, for example, moving our body. We hold hands at the end of the service to say goodbye. And so the senses, in this case touch, is stimulated by these connections with people and by the ways that we move our body. The intellectual aspect of myself is stimulated by listening to the sermon. We had a wonderful minister who wrote thought-provoking and articulate, compassionate sermons, which engage my mind, among other aspects of myself. And my heart is engaged as well by the Sunday service. I'm often moved by the choir, for example, or by the space of the sanctuary itself, the way the light comes in, the colors. So heart, mind, body, spirit, and soul. You can see from this example, perhaps you attend a place of worship yourself, and perhaps you can connect that to the different ways that yourself is engaged within that place of worship, different aspects of yourself. Just a couple of notes about the self. So my understanding is that in Hinduism, the universe is referred to as the capital S self, and the person, the individual, is the small s self. This is a really cool way of thinking about the relationship between the part and the whole, because of course each of us is a part of all there is, of all being, of the universe. And it's often with a sense of relief that we give up this notion of freedom, free will, which can seem burdensome to us at times, and as if disappear into the cosmos. And quite wonderfully, we see at a microscopic level, in terms of electrons circling around a nucleus, what we also see on a macroscopic level, which is with a solar system, the different planets orbiting the sun, for example. So I hope these ideas are helpful for you. Of course, books have been written on all of them, and I'm trying to encapsulate these three very complex ones in one video, shadow, ego, and self. But I'd be curious and delighted to receive feedback from you about what you understood, what you liked, what you think needs work. But this is a kind of first draft, and I just really wanted to share and be of service in reflecting on these ideas that have been so helpful for me in my spiritual journey. These 5 ideas that I've discussed over 2 videos are soul, spirit, shadow, ego, and self. Thanks for listening.